As I was doing research for one of my recent videos about amazing animal defenses, I was looking into the different species of horned lizard, when one of their Wikipedia pages caught my eye. A horned lizard was discovered in the late 19th century before it disappeared for the next 70 years. A little more research and I found the story of the scientists that set out to rediscover it. Lost species are not as uncommon as one might think, but the ones that are rediscovered are the most exciting. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you like this kind of content, then please help the channel out by liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate your support. In 1897, Raymond L. Ditmars was the curator of reptiles at the New York Zoological Park. One day, a friend of his named Mr. Eustace brought Ditmars something he suspected he would be excited about: 2 small horned lizards that he said were collected from northwestern Mexico in the state of Sonora. They were similar to other known species of horned lizards, being small, flat, and brown, but they had a couple of unique features. For one, their horns were significantly smaller than other known species. Second, their diminished horns meant that from above, they appeared to have a heart-shaped head. One of the lizards was already dead, so it was immediately placed into the museum's collection, but the other was still alive. Ditmars kept it for nearly a year and observed its behavior. When it eventually died, it too was placed in the museum's collection. In 1905, Ditmars wrote a letter to a colleague, Dr. Leonard Steniger, at the United States National Museum. Steniger was the curator of the reptile department there and was interested to hear about the strange horned lizard that Ditmars had kept and observed back in 1897. Ditmars told him just how strange the lizard was, writing, "This creature used to jump clear off the ground in most clown-like fashion when annoyed, emitting a series of hisses like miniature sneezes." Steniger suspected that it might be a species that was new to science. He requested that the 2 specimens be sent over. The following year, Steniger described them as a new species, giving them the epithet Phrynosoma ditmarsi and the common name of Ditmars's horned lizard, in honor of his colleague. Ditmars's horned lizard entered the scientific literature, but no one paid much attention to it for the next 50 years. In the 1950s, Dr. Charles H. Lowe of the University of Arizona became fascinated by the lost horned lizard species from Sonora. He began to keep an eye open for the species. He searched through collections and spoke with people working in the area, but never managed to rediscover it. His fascination with Ditmars's horned lizard was well known among those he worked with. One of his graduate students, Mike Robinson, had probably heard the stories of the rare horned lizard that captured Lowe's imagination. It was because Lowe brought awareness to the species that Robinson was able to recognize it when he saw it. Robinson didn't find a living lizard, but while he was looking through some of the hundreds of specimens that had been collected in 1890 during an expedition through northwestern Mexico, he found a small lizard with a heart-shaped head, and it caught his eye. In 1890, the Lumholtz Archaeological Expedition, sponsored by the American Museum of Natural History, left the United States and traveled through northeastern Sonora and northwestern Chihuahua, Mexico. Their primary mission was to do archaeological exploration, but for the first 2 years, they also collected quite a number of animals and plant specimens, particularly in the autumn of 1890. Unfortunately, because the biological collection wasn't the focus of the Lumholtz expedition, many of the specimens collected didn't have proper data recorded. Many were entirely untagged, and those that were tagged were often missing the date of collection or the location that they were collected from. To make matters worse, The records of where the group traveled to and what dates they arrived and left different places were also poorly made. So the small horned lizard had sat unclassified in a museum collection for 80 years. In 1969, Robinson presented his find to the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum and was given a grant to search for the species. He connected with fellow herpetologist Vincent D. Roth, and the two discussed at length their theories of the missing horned lizard. They believed that it may not actually be a valid species at all due to how few specimens existed, and if it was valid, they thought it was highly likely that it was already extinct. But still, their desire to rediscover it was strong. They needed to figure out where to look for it. They hypothesized that the species was probably montane, like the similar pygmy short-horned lizard, and they pored over the records of the route the Lumholtz expedition took to try to guess where the species might have been collected from. But they needed more information. They tried to find any living descendant of Mr. Eustace, the man who had donated the 2 specimens to Ditmars, but they had no luck. The two continued to search through the mountains of Sonora, hopeful that they would stumble on the species by some miracle, but they had no luck. They began to wonder if the lizard would ever be found again. In spring of 1970, Roth was helping one of his students by identifying the stomach contents of some lizard specimens that she was working with. Suddenly, he had an idea. Perhaps the mystery of the location of Ditmars' horned lizard could be solved by looking at what was in the stomachs of the 3 specimens that they already had. They felt that their best bet was to start with the oldest specimen that was collected on the Lumholtz expedition. This is because it had been directly collected from the field and hadn't spent any time in captivity before dying. So they sent a letter to the American Museum of Natural History requesting the stomach and intestines of their Ditmars' horned lizard specimen, and the museum sent them over in the mail. Their contents were washed in alcohol and sorted by type. They found 18 different types of item, including pebbles, 3 types of seed, and 14 species of insect. Roth and his team were so excited by the results that they knew that they needed to study the other 2 specimens. So they sent for them immediately, but there were a few problems. They knew that one of the 2 was kept in captivity for a year before being added to the collection, and so the contents of its stomach wouldn't help. But they also weren't sure how long the other specimen had been kept by Mr. Eustace before it died. It was possible that it had nothing helpful in its digestive system at all. Then they got a letter back from the museum. One of the 2 specimens had already been eviscerated and was missing its digestive tract, and there was no way of knowing if it was the one that had been kept alive or the one that Mr. Eustace had donated that was already deceased. Roth tells the story of the tense moment in an article he wrote for the Sonoran herpetologist. When the specimen arrived by registered mail, excitement charged the laboratory as I opened the package, and one of the 3 known specimens in the world was unveiled. And as the cheesecloth shroud was unfolded, unveiled it was. Such an insignificant animal, alcohol-soaked, gray, dead over 70 years. The tips of many tubercles rubbed off, the short horns just as Steneger had described. With some trepidation, the lizard was opened by Ralph Lutke, a volunteer assistant at the station, and the stomach and intestines removed. We held our collective breaths as the first slit was made, and out popped grama grass seeds, Botaloa species, and Apache harvester ant heads. Pagana myrmex apache, the same seed and species of ant as found in the American Museum of Natural History specimens. The stomach contents were from the Southwest and not laboratory food. We were on the right track. But next came the most difficult task. Identifying all of the contents to see how they would help solve the mystery. In total, 30 different items were found in the stomachs of the two lizards, but identifying them all in the late 1960s was much more complicated than it would be today. Without the internet, each species needed to be found in books or identified by experts. Around 50 letters were sent out to museums and experts across North America, and an additional 50 people were directly contacted to help make sense of the fragments from the stomachs. The lizards are insectivores, so it was clear as to why the pebbles and seeds were in their stomachs. The ants. As the ants cleared small pebbles out of their nests, or as they brought grass seeds back, the lizards ate them, ingesting their cargo at the same time. But did the pebbles or seeds offer any clues? The pebbles couldn't be entirely identified. A rock expert did manage to make some general observations about the pebbles, including the fact that they were from a generally brown to red substrate. He also noted that their composition was something similar to diorite. Sidney Williams of the Phelps Dodge Corporation at Douglas, Arizona, felt that they were andesite, and based on the information available suggested that Roth and his team searched two specific mountain ranges, Sierra El Manzanal and Sierra San Luis, both located in Sonora and both containing large deposits of andesite. The exact species of grass seeds also couldn't be identified, but grass experts knew that they were grama species, with at least one belonging to the Muhlenbergia genus of bullgrasses. There were 8 species of ant identified. Ant specialists made summaries of the habitats and ranges of each. The team spent months doing further research, collecting ants from Sonora to better establish their ranges. By doing so, it was determined that most of the species occurred together between 4,800 and 5,400 feet on dry hillsides, often adjacent to rivers or streams. Identifying the other insects found in the stomachs also proved to be extremely helpful. In Ontario, Canada, Dr. Anne Howden examined the weevils found in the lizards and noticed that her husband had collected a similar specimen a few years prior. The one he had collected was an undescribed species of Pandaletius weevil, and he had made a detailed record of its collection. It was found in a juniper forest in southern Sonora at an elevation of around 7,000 feet. The other insects and spiders were examined as well. A true bug was identified as being similar to a species from southern Arizona that feeds on leaf litter at high altitudes. The grasshoppers were fully developed, indicating that the lizards were collected in the autumn, and the species present, Barytetex humphreysii, was known to only inhabit northern Sonora in an area west of Agua Prieta. This meant that Sierra San Luis couldn't have been the collection location. After examining all the evidence, it seemed that the lizards were most likely living high in the mountains of Sonora, Mexico, probably in an area with juniper forests and reddish-brown substrate. The grass expert who identified the bullgrass made the following determination. The most likely location of the lizards would be a canyon habitat with a small stream, rocky slopes, grass, oak juniper, possibly with sycamores on the canyon floor. It looked to me like the lizard was foraging above the streams, between the stream and the sides of the canyon. Now all that was left to do was to find them. Much had changed in the area since the original 3 specimens were collected. The habitat had been altered by farming and human settlement. The vegetation had changed dramatically, and the climate wasn't quite what it was back then either. Roth and his team wondered if the lizards may have had their range pushed further south. Nevertheless, they decided to begin in the north, where they suspected the specimens had originally been collected. In 1970, Roth finally began crossing the border into Mexico to search for the lost horned lizard in the mountains of northern Sonora. he would cross with friends, family, and other volunteers, and he was regularly searching alongside Charles Lowe and Mike Robinson. Their search was focused on the canyons of Sierra Manzanal. Each trip, Roth would cross into Mexico at Agua Prieta, gather supplies, and then head out into the backcountry, trying different roads and routes, stopping in any spot that looked promising to search for Ditmars' horned lizard. Whenever they passed locals, they would ask if they had seen any horned lizards around, but they were almost always met with a no. But it was a chance encounter with a local that would finally get them somewhere. On one trip down, they picked up a hitchhiker who needed a ride out to his farm. Along the way, they asked him if he had seen any horned lizards around, but as with most of the other people that they had asked, he hadn't noticed any. After getting him to his farm, the group found a spot nearby that looked promising for a search. They looked around and found nothing, and so they decided to camp there. In the morning, they noticed that there was a mining operation nearby. Roth had wondered if perhaps Mr. Eustace had found his 2 lizard specimens while working at a mining operation in the area, so he decided to stop by with his daughter to ask about any lizards that may have been seen in the area. On site, they met an engineer named Hector Lopez. While Roth and his daughter knew very little Spanish, and Lopez knew very little English, they managed to communicate with him that they were searching for horned lizards. And to their surprise, Lopez was familiar with the horned lizards. In fact, his children had recently found some on the mining site and had been playing with them only a few days before. While of course this didn't mean that they were Ditmars' horned lizard, the pair were excited at the prospect. They informed Lopez that they would return soon, and that if anyone managed to capture a specimen of the lizard they were looking for, they would receive an award of 100 pesos. With that, Roth and his team left and continued their search elsewhere. It was another 2 weeks before Roth found himself in the area again. He headed up to the mining site to speak with Lopez, but discovered that he was not there. In his place was an American engineer named Paul Geiger. Geiger informed Roth that as of yet, no horned lizards had been found, but he assured them that he would continue to keep an eye out. Roth and the team searched around again, but having found no evidence of horned lizards in the area, they felt that it was likely a dead end, and decided that they probably wouldn't return, as they were likely in the wrong place. 2 more weeks passed, when Geiger called Roth asking to meet in Douglas, the city on the U.S. side of the border near Agua Prieta. One of the men on site had captured a horned lizard. Roth and a few volunteers got to the meeting point early in the morning and waited for Geiger to arrive. When he got there, he handed them a box, and the team excitedly opened it. But their joy quickly turned to disappointment. The lizard in the box didn't look exactly like they had expected it to. In particular, the horns seemed a little larger than they were supposed to be. Roth felt that what they actually had here was a specimen of the similar pygmy short-horned lizard. A short time later, Lowe arrived. He peered through a hole in the box and agreed this wasn't the species they were after. They gave Geiger a few dollars to give to whoever had captured it, and the group dispersed, with Lowe taking the lizard in the box back to the lab with him. The very next day, Lowe called Roth to say that he and Robinson were going to meet him in Douglas again the following day. Roth couldn't think why, and no additional information was provided. Lowe and Robinson had spent more time closely examining the lizard in the box. When they got to the abdominal keeled scales, it was clear that this wasn't a pygmy short-horned lizard after all, but in fact, the long-lost Ditmars' horned lizard that Lowe had been searching for 20 years. It hadn't been collected from a canyon alongside a stream as the team had suspected, but rather from the top of a rocky, oak-covered hill with sandy red soil. This was a possible reason that the team had missed it the entire time. The men were finally able to locate wild specimens themselves and study them in depth, and in 1971, its rediscovery was published. Now we know much more about the species. Known from across the state of Sonora, their habitat type is limited, and their exact range and numbers are unknown. The majority of the lizards that have been documented have been single lizards found far apart from each other. In 2019, a high school student named Jose Abel was looking for the species around Las Playitas in the southern part of Sonora. He managed to photograph 11 individuals on Rancho Las Playitas, eventually leading scientists back there to study them. The species seems to prefer thorn scrub and deciduous Sinaloan woodlands. They're also one of 8 horned lizard species that are known to shoot blood from their eyes as a form of defense. I actually covered this in a recent video about animal defenses, which you can check out by clicking the banner at the top of the screen. Despite the fact that the species has been rediscovered, they remain relatively unstudied and unassessed by the IUCN. This means no surveys of population size have ever been completed, and conservation efforts have been difficult to implement due to a low understanding of their ecology and their habitat. While we know very little, one thing we do know is that the species has been found, and it continues to survive in the secluded scrublands of Sonora. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed hearing the story of the rediscovery of Ditmars' horned lizard. Do you prefer videos like this where I focus on a single species, or the list videos that I make? Let me know in the comments below. I also need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Now before you go, why not watch another? Click the thumbnail on the screen to hear more amazing stories of our natural world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.